As the American Revolution began, so did the fight for the Hudson River. The Hudson River is a 315-mile river spanning from the Adirondack Mountains in northern New York down into NYC, where it flows into New York Harbor and out into the Atlantic Ocean. Both the Americans and British put an emphasis on controlling this waterway. John Adams said it was the key to the whole continent. The Americans didn't have much of a navy at the time, so they couldn't meet the mighty Royal Navy head on. So the Americans' plan to keep control of the Hudson was twofold. First, they needed to build fortifications and batteries along the river, but that wouldn't be enough since the British ships could slip by under the cover of darkness. They also needed to slow down or block the British vessels in the river in order to hit the ships with cannons and mortars from land positions on both sides. The first attempts at protecting the Hudson River was by constructing obstacles across the Hudson in 1776. The Continental Army constructed an array of logs sunk underwater between Fort Washington on the island of Manhattan and Fort Lee across the river. But shortly after, the British took control of both forts in battles in November of 76, putting this defensive barrier in the hands of the British. The Americans also constructed the Fort Montgomery chain about 40 miles upriver, which was protected by Fort Montgomery and Fort Clinton. George Washington put Captain Thomas Mansion, a British-trained engineer, in charge of designing and installing a chain across the Hudson. In November of 76, a faulty link broke under stress induced by the strong Hudson River currents, showing the difficulties of trying to chain the Hudson. The chain was later repaired and reset. In October of 1777, British forces led by General Sir Henry Clinton came up from British-controlled New York City and easily captured the two colonial forts protecting the chain, which were commanded by brothers General George Clinton, first governor of New York, and General James Clinton. This battle is referred to sometimes as the Battle of the Clintons because the number of participants with that name, but it's not believed that the brothers were related to the British general. The British then dismantled the chain and went further upriver and raided Kingston, which was the first capital of New York, and set the city on fire. The importance of the river continued to grow since the British forces had control of both Quebec and New York City and were putting pressure on the Continental Army from both sides. If the British controlled the river as well, it would allow British forces in Quebec to connect with the forces in New York City and would basically cut off New England to the rest of the colonies, pretty much breaking the Continental Army into two, making it harder for lines of communication and to move supplies and troops where needed, which would have created a dire circumstance for the underdog Continental Army. The Americans knew they had to do something before they lost control of the river. New York Governor George Clinton, who was also on the committee to help protect the river from the British, did take notice of the fact that the British never attempted to run ships through the Fort Montgomery chain in the Battle of the Clintons, and believed that this idea was good, but needed better execution and better protection from land. George Washington ordered for a new, bigger, and stronger chain to be built, and Captain Thomas Mansion was once again tasked with starting to work on this new, great chain. Washington considered the West Point area along the Hudson to be the most strategic location in America, with its prominent plateau on the west bank of the Hudson River, calling it the key to America. It would be the perfect place for fortifications and batteries to protect the new Great Chain from water or land attacks. It was also the perfect place for the new chain since the Hudson River narrows and bends in an S shape at West Point. Ships had to navigate this tricky section of curved river with shifting currents and wind very carefully and slowly, making it harder for a ship to gain enough momentum to attempt to ram the chain and break through it. It made it even easier for the Americans to hit any ships that tried to get by the fortifications, making all Royal Navy ships sitting ducks. The large chain links that were made for the new Great Chain were brought in by oxen-pulled sleds and varied in size a little, but most were around 2 feet each and weighed roughly 120 pounds. Sections of the chain were floated out on 16 by 12 foot log rafts and connected to each other using various fasteners. In total, the Great Chain spanned 600 yards and weighed around 65 tons, connecting to West Point on the southern end and Constitution Island on the north end. Both ends were anchored to log cribs filled with rocks. Just downriver, a second barrier of log booms was floated, making it harder for ships to gain enough momentum to break the chain. A system of pulleys, rollers, ropes, and anchors were used to adjust the chain's tension to avoid any issues with the strong river currents and changing tides. Sections of the chain could be opened to allow boats through if needed. Each winter, the chain was removed to avoid destruction from the ice. With fortifications at West Point and Constitution Island, along with the Great Chain in place, the Americans had a stronghold on most of the Hudson that they would never relinquish. George Washington made West Point his headquarters for several months in 1779. The British never attempted to break through the Great Chain. The closest the Americans came to losing the stronghold was when trader Benedict Arnold became commander of West Point and the Great Chain in August of 1780, and he immediately started to do anything to weaken its defenses, like not make repairs on the chain, etc. He recommended to the British that they could possibly break through the barrier when he was handing them over the fortification plans for West Point. Luckily, Arnold's deceit was uncovered shortly after. The Continental Army remained in control of most of the Hudson for the rest of the war, which was one of the keys to victory. I remember visiting West Point as a kid and learning about the Great Chain. It's something that I've always been intrigued with, and I enjoyed making this video on it. I hope you enjoyed it as well. Please consider subscribing for more fun videos. Thanks. Take care.